A warm welcome once again to everyone. My name is Josef Lentsch. I am the founder and CEO of Partisan and the Political Tech Summit. It's great to have you all with us tonight. And of course, it's great to have two experts with us to discuss the future of digital political advertising. They will share their expertise. This is the second webinar we have on this topic. There was a lot of interest in the first webinar that we had about a month ago after Meta's decision to stop paid political ads in the EU. And today is a follow-up. Of course, this is a whole dynamic field. So we see what has changed, but also now, of course, that political organizations have learned about what will happen and what October will bring in terms of changes. We will discuss the implications. We will discuss the legal uncertainties, the questions that may be there in the room that people may face and organizations may face. And I'm very glad that Jochen and Maya are with us. Jochen König, he's the CEO of Cosmonauts and Kings in Germany. He's an expert on political advertising regulation. Perhaps you saw his recent deep dive into TTPA on LinkedIn, and it just posted another great post. So a warm welcome to you, Jochen.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Great to be here.
And also a warm welcome to Maya Hutchinson. She's the co-founder of BattlegroundAI. She's based in Denver, Colorado, so she brings also a US perspective, but of course a transatlantic perspective as well. Also, she just introduced a new asset generation tool called Programmatic, which we will talk about as well tonight. A warm welcome to you too, Maya.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Great. Well, let's kick things off and let's dive right into it. So TTPA, that's short for the Transparency and Targeting of Political Advertising Regulation. Jochen, I already mentioned that you recently posted an analysis of TTPA on your LinkedIn account. Now, if we look at the broader implications for the industry, for the political industry, the advertising industry, the long-term effects of players, that when we see Meta and Google are leaving the field, can you give us a bit of an insight and can you kick things off with how do you see this from an agency perspective as well?
So I think that on the long run, the withdrawal from Meta and Google, and by the way, it's not just Meta and Google, it's also LinkedIn and TikTok, which we sometimes forget because the initial discussion started around with the latest announcement of Meta to ban political ads. It will fundamentally reshape the industry. First, and immediately it already creates a vacuum that disrupts how democratic actors reach voters in the digital sphere, right? So paid political ads were one of the few ways to counterbalance algorithm-driven visibility. And by losing this tool, this is a disadvantage for democratic parties because they rely much more on elements like paid ads than extremist movements that often mobilize organically, right? And second, we will see a reallocation of budgets and a big innovation pressure that is now hitting the industry and the market. So the demand-side platforms, publishers, new ad tech providers are already exploring TTPA compliant solutions, and the industry will professionalize around the transparency and the reporting and the compliance that come along with TTPA. But what is extremely concerning and what I'm really worried about, and this is something that cannot put aside, is that politics has to communicate where people form their opinions, their political opinions, right? And the dominant areas in the digital public sphere in the democratic societies are these platforms. And by the fact that we now basically come to a stop of political ads means that one of the most critical places where people form their political opinions is not anymore accessible via ads. So obviously we can talk about if ads are the right approach, but we know that the algorithms are not really in favor of political content, especially not political content that is not on the extremist side. So I think this will definitely have a long-term effect that cannot be put aside, because what politics needs to do in every single matter, right? If you're an interest group, if you're a party, if you're a ministry of a government, you want to reach as many people as possible, to inform them, to convince them. So it is critical for a digital public sphere that you reach the citizens. And actually, this is something that always fascinated me about the fact when platforms occurred, right? So suddenly you have the opportunity to reach masses on a different level than it was able before. And now with a ban, we rely completely again for the foreseeable future on these algorithms and on organic reach. And that is something that is not strengthening the digital democratic discourse, it's actually weakening it.
Thank you, Jochen. Now, Maya, as Jochen says, right, I mean, political organizations need to communicate, so that doesn't change, right? So they won't stop communicating. They will have to adapt. They will have to start communicating with different means. Now, before we go into the detail here, but which parts of the industry do you think, when you think about the parties or unions, associations, agencies, platforms, publishers, which parts do you think are under the most pressure to adapt to this change?
Yeah, that was a very insightful and helpful intro for sure too. I think everyone has to pay attention to policy changes, any organization, big or small. But and of course that is important to us as a platform and a provider. But I do think, and my background is also previously in working in agencies, both in politics and in corporate sector, is that agencies really sit at that critical intersection. They're working with clients, they're working with platforms all the time. They sit at this really important intersection of a lot of different changes, and they have to be constantly thinking of new ways to adapt and new ways to advise their clients and be at the forefront and be strategically advising people and also, adapting and testing new tools. I think they really sit at that a very, very important intersection to inform how our platforms adapt, how clients use them. And I think sometimes it's not always the first entity that you think of, but I definitely think that agencies have a much bigger challenge when it comes to these changes.
Maya, you are, of course, based in Denver, Colorado. So what's the US perspective now, of course, with different kind of regulations that apply? Does it make a change for US players who are active in Europe? How do they handle that? Or basically, is it just, business as usual?
Yeah, we have a lot going on here. So lots of changes all the time. And I think, one of the big, obviously here we're dealing with a lot of patchwork legislation on the state level, which is overwhelming and can also be a really big challenge. And then when we look globally, and you can see it, I think the end result of this legislation was that then companies just immediately pulled out. And I don't ever think that that's the goal or intention necessarily of good policy and good legal frameworks, is not to have a corporation or a company or any organization just walk away. Should be a negotiation. It should be a conversation, especially when it comes, I think the larger corporations are getting an unfair spotlight, but it impacts so many smaller organizations too, smaller platforms, smaller social networks that are at an even bigger disadvantage, that maybe wouldn't want to just walk away from a whole giant market. So I think that everyone has to pay attention to it, but it does disproportionately impact those smaller folks.
Thanks, Jochen. Of course, now with the changes underway, this might open up, in theory, some opportunities for European platforms, European publishers. Do you see there is a window of opportunity to step in here, to step up?
Maybe. Look, the challenge at the end is when we put out political ads, our goal is to reach specific audiences. And when we look at TTPA closer, we see two major changes when it comes down to targeting. So first of all, you need to have the access. That's again, the big thing about the platforms, right? So they have millions of users. They represent a big portion of the users of a society in all European countries. So first of all, you need the users, you need access to them. And when you cannot use the platforms anymore, you have to go and find other strategies, right? So what Maya is working on, what other people and organizations and companies are working on, is obviously that programmatic will play a way bigger role than it did in the past. That's just one of the channels. But the challenging thing at the end is we have to look closer at TTPA when we see the regulations in terms of targeting. And the first thing is you can only use the data that you directly collected from individuals. You cannot use third-party data. That's one extremely important factor, right? And second, you need an opt-in for political ads. That means basically if you browse through the web and you visit your favorite news site and there should be, and that someone is trying to place there, for example, a display ad, you need consent before that you allow to be seen a political ad. And second, the fact that you address the user needs to be directly linked to the data point that you're using. And obviously, this is a potential opportunity and also an opportunity that also we explore at CNK, but it is challenging. It is really challenging to find and work ways to leverage that. I think at the end, the biggest opportunity is that the budgets are going to shift, and they're going to shift on the long run. And I don't think that political advertising is getting cheaper. That's one factor. Once again, for NGOs and smaller political organizations, it's challenging because the prices will increase, definitely on short term and on the midterm perspective. And that's not good news from my point of view. There is a potential to be leveraged, but it is challenging. Doesn't matter who you are, which type of organizations or company you are, it is a challenge that we are looking towards right now.
Thank you, Jochen. So before we move on to the topic of legal uncertainty and what this regulation actually has produced in practice, let me just remind you, everyone who's on the call, that you can post questions at any time. So there should be, if you have updated your Zoom browser, there should be a Q&A button down below. So if at any point you have a comment or a thought you want to get in, then please just post there and I'll try to get it in wherever it may fit. Otherwise, of course, you can also post in the chat. Once again, thanks all for joining. Thanks Maya for posting that. And yeah, please feel free to jump on board. I would love to have this as much as interactive as possible. Now, so if we move on to legal uncertainty, Jochen, in your recent post on the TTPA, you really kind of talked about legal uncertainty and that this is a problem because people don't really know what falls under the regime, under the regulation, what is a political ad, and so on. So could you unpack for us for a moment what those uncertainties are in terms of definitions, in terms of enforcing the regulation, and also in terms of the cost implications of the compliance?
Sure. So first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so this is all my personal opinion and interpretation of it, right? So that's important to mention. The first thing when you look at TTPA is to think about who is affected by the regulation and when. And in article number 3, it's very clear who is being considered as a political actor. And there are a couple of political actors mentioned where it's obvious and clear, right? So it's political party, it's also the governmental bodies and organizations, it's candidates, it's members of parliament. So everything they do with paid ads is by default TTPA, has to be by default TTPA compliant, right? And then you have this one exception for government ministries. They are partially excluded, right? So governmental bodies are excluded. They only have to apply to TTPA if the content of the ad has the goal to have an influence on a legislative or regulatory process, right? And even coming down to this momentum, it's a question. For example, if you post as a government, like we have a new general budget plan for 2026, right? It's just a draft, but that's something you couldn't post because it's still in the process. But on the other hand, you inform at the end of it citizens that now the budget is in place and these are the elements of it, then you can produce an ad. So the political actor thing is the one thing. The second thing is that if you're an NGO, if you're a corporate company, if you are an association, an interest group, right? Then article number 8 comes into place. And article number 8 defines what constitutes a political ad. So it's the content, it's the message, it's the targeting group, it's the purpose of it, right? And this leaves a lot of room of interpretation. And now currently the Commission is in work to clarify that on the implementation guideline, right? So it's to be expected now in Q4 to be released. So the one thing is that you see, okay, you have to be TTBA compliant via the definition of what is a political actor in Article number 3, or you have to look at it ad by ad based on Article number 8. And this is challenging. The other legal uncertainties are a little bit more in the field of the transparency of target groups, of budgets, and other elements. So basically, all these criteria are not that critical and not that difficult, and they're not even that difficult to implement in theory. But when it really comes down to it, on the long run, we are not sure how the compliance cost will be on the long run and how regulatory's going to look and interfere with it. And I think what concerned big platforms especially is the definition of political advertising, what constitutes a political ad, and then the enforcement of the regulation if you're not following it very clear. There are a couple of technical implications that are not that easy. As mentioned, once again, the question which data you're allowed to use, and second, the opt-in obligation. This is technical challenging and reduces the reach. But the legal uncertainty comes mainly from, once again, the question, what is political ad, a political ad, and what is not a political ad? And this broad definition is one of the fields where we are concerned about.
Thank you. What should political advertisers do? How should they operate while they wait on this clarification that Jochen says will happen in Q4? Now we're in this kind of transitional period. I think the Meta will turn off the ads in October, right? And then there's at some point in Q4 the clarification guideline will come. So how to operate if you're in a campaign right now, for example? What should they do?
I mean, I would operate as if you're already in the legislation and start to think about new, innovative, and they're going to be less efficient, certainly, and they're going to take more time and probably cost more right now. But I would start to take this time immediately to act like this is in place, and to look for new and innovative channels. I do think that, yes, appears to be very highly restrictive, but I do think in regulation, there's always an opportunity for innovation and folks to find new channels. And I think we'll talk about this in a bit too, but like in context of where you're advertising, are there new innovative places where you can start to think about ways to reach people? And you don't have to, I know the biggest restriction, as we just talked about, is on personal information, or that you've collected from folks, but there's still ways to understand people's behavior, their personas, what are they doing, where are they getting your information from, that we can start to think about ways to craft our message and to craft content to reach those people. But it is going to be a challenge. So I would start earlier. I've always talked about starting earlier rather than later, and never put too much of your strategy into one platform. This is a very good example of not doing that, but those are easier channels. This means there will be more lift, and I know there are a couple of questions on this too that we can obviously dive deeper into.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good prompt, because we just have some questions and comments from the audience. Thanks already for contributing. So one participant asks, how will this all impact DOOH advertising? Will it still be offered for political ads, you think? And could you further elaborate on the programmatic advertising? I think the programmatic advertising we'll talk about in a moment or two. But what about DOOH advertising, Jochen, Maya, to the two of you? And then there's another question from Valon. What can we define, or what do we define as a political ad? It's incredibly difficult to draw a clear line. So what about an ad for non-profit that advocates for a specific policy? So we're here exactly in this gray zone, right? Kind of. So what is it actually? So how do you expect to resolve the commission in their clarification guideline to deal with those cases? So two questions: DOH advertising and the case of the non-profit that advocates for a policy. Do we want to start with DOH advertising? Who wants to take that?
Maya.
Yeah, I mean, happy to let you go first, but yeah, digital out of home. I believe that, just doesn't, if it doesn't require the personal information, that should still be a channel that's available for advertising, and one we can dive more into the specifics around.
I agree with Maya. There are a couple of difficulties in digital out of home, but we are also extremely confident that there is a TTPA compliant solution that maybe not even requires TTPA compliant implementations. Example, right? So if you place digital out of home here in Berlin and you strategically place it, for example, around the parliament or around certain train stations at certain times when the parliament is holding their sessions, if you book it based on data like this, then you would have a TTPA topic. If you just in general say you decide to do a placement there without any data in the background, why should it be TTPA compliant, right? Because you just made the decision not based on data, but based on experience, for example. And that maybe leads once again also to the second question, what defines it, what not defines it, right? So it's now getting really interesting discussions. But one thing to add to the digital out of home, I still would post a QR code that gives a background around the digital ad, digital out of home ad, right? So because it doesn't hurt, it's just information that you could place also in the ad in the background, even if it doesn't have to be TTPA compliant. So I'm also really confident that digital out of home will be available in the future without TTPA restrictions.
Maya, do you want to give your view on the second question around kind of, what does constitute a political ad, and whether a nonprofit that advocates for a specific policy will in the future fall under regulation? What's your guess there?
Yeah, it would be a little bit more of a guess, but certainly based on sort of the outline of the policy, it sounds like that would be included in these regulations. If you're advocating in any capacity around bills or legislations or way people are going to be voting, if you're not a political entity, NGOs, we have a similar thing in the States. If you're, a C4 organization, that falls under political requirements. And so I would always err on the side that if you're working in a space, that you probably need to be very clear on following these regulations and how you think about advertising.
Jochen, Maya says she thinks this will fall under the regulation. What do you think? Would you agree? Would you disagree?
I agree on the point that it can fall under regulation, right? So NGOs, for example, are not defined per default as a political actor in Article number 3. So in general, the classification, if they have to comply to TTPA, comes along with the definition of what political advertising is and what a political ad constitutes. And we once again always fall back to the element of, let me just quote the definition of Article number 3, number 2, any form of advertising which is liable, designed to influence the outcome of an election, a referendum, voting behavior, a legislative or a regulatory process. This is really the core sentence in Article number 3, as well as in the following, I think Article number 8 as well. So our strategy here is really to decide ad by ad and also design the content of an ad in the spirit of this guideline. What is like, if you are an NGO and you're obviously advocating for a certain cause, for a specific regulation, for a specific policy change, then obviously TTPA comes into place. But there are strategies that may possible that give you a chance as an NGO to post ads, to talk more about your organization, to talk about more of a broader issue that has more room of interpretation. And this is once again where the legal uncertainty comes into place, and where definitely disputes will show up by questioning, does it fall under TTPA or not? In general, I agree totally with Maya that transparency by design and regulation compliance by default, that's the way to operate. But still, in terms of this broad definition of what a political ad constitutes, our strategy is to make decisions ad by ad, content by content, cause by cause, and move for that, especially for the field of NGOs and foundations forward.
Thanks both. So one more question on this from the audience, from Paula. By the way, thanks, many thanks for contributing, everyone. It's great. And Katarina, as you have posted more than one thought, don't worry, I haven't forgotten you, but we'll get to adaptation strategies and new tools in a second. Paula is asking, I'm wondering if that's going to be an opportunity to focus more on awareness advertising and for example, DOOH, as we just talked about it. How to make this an integrated experience with donor member journeys online, for example. Maya, I saw you nodding there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's aware. They're going to be more awareness-based campaigns, right? These are going to be less targeted than we were previously, from a data perspective. But and that's on the platform, right? That's the data that you use in the platform or from third parties. But that doesn't prevent you from, again, building your content and your message with that information in mind, right? With contextual information about where people are, how we can reach them. I think digital out of home is a perfect example, right? If you're trying to reach folks commuting to work, right? If you're trying to reach people in specific instances or newsletters, or where we can find opportunity in media sites or sponsorships, or where are those placements that we still have opportunity to, and where we can still create messaging and content that is hyper relevant to those people, that fits into that space, and doesn't have to have the, we can operate and get a lot of work done still, without having all of that proprietary information. If you have your own data set, and that obviously again skews to larger organizations who have large databases of supporters, and email lists for fundraising, right? Again, this legislation is inherently hurting the smaller actors there, but in places where we can start to innovate and drive new reach and new awareness, and that's where you're going to find the opportunity. Converting and getting donors this way definitely presents more challenges. We can probably talk through a lot more on the conversion side too, and how that will be impacted, because that again is going to be more challenging, but that means more innovation in other tools and messaging platforms.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. So let's move on to tools, new tools and adaptation, as there already are some questions from the audience there as well. For example, Katarina, thank you very much, is saying, I wonder about solutions and ideas. How and where can we do lead generation now? How about online fundraising ads? Any ideas how to replace Meta here? Maya, you just launched Programmatic, as I mentioned, at BattlegroundAI. Can you give us some insight into the tool, how it works, and how do tools like that potentially help campaigns to navigate the new landscape?
Yeah, so I think we're a content generation, and focus on advertising and compliance, and working in this sector. And I think again, you can still do a lot, especially when it comes, and I know that's a whole set of other regulations when it comes to AI, that we can have another discussion on. But we try to apply that, both the lens of AI regulation space and advertising regulation, to create content that's compliant. Now, we don't run and execute ads, so from a programmatic vendor perspective or a DSP perspective, those platforms are going to still have those TTPA requirements around targeting, but you don't need that information. You don't need personal information or third-party targeting data to create content that is much more contextually fit, and also scalable. I think what we don't want to have happen is let regulation stop us from trying new tools and trying to innovate, and pushing that space forward. No one is going to be doing that unless it comes from us and we're pushing that. We need to be able to still get our work done. We still need to do that in a more efficient way, and we still need to use these tools. And so how do we do both of those things? And that's really what we're trying to solve there, and have real tangible outputs for people, not just sort of nebulous content or things that can't be applied immediately. I know that we will start to have to face a lot more of that now as we go into this new regulation, but that will come, from folks pushing us to make those changes, and that's really important.
Thanks. Well, will be exciting to see the rollout of the tool and how it's being taken up. Jochen, what alternatives do we have is also a question by Katharina. So you said it's not just, of course, Meta and Google. It's also TikTok. It's also LinkedIn. So what places are left when it comes to where I can reach people with ads?
Yes, so we already see innovation emerge, like what Maya is doing, what other organizations, companies are doing, also what we're doing at C&K. So I think that we see a shift in terms of the approach of political advertising, definitely for Europe, because programmatic, for example, is shifting away from the personal data towards contextual targeting, because the micro-targeting approach is not possible on a scale like it used to be, and it has been restricted for good reasons over the last 5-6 years. And matching ads to the content environment rather than micro-profiling individuals is the way to go forward. Because once again, right, so we have the opt-in discussion and we have the data collecting issue that TTPA restricts very clearly. So that makes campaigns in general then more TTPA compliant and still relevant. And yes, what are the spaces that are left? So what worries me the most is that we are coming back to an era where we think that landing pages, email newsletters, and which is already difficult, for example, the German market in terms of adaptation, in terms of SMS notifications or WhatsApp group or messenger groups, to going back like it's been 2008 or 2012 and the Obama era is coming back, right? So by saying, okay, I build my landing page and I try to drive people there and then I collect the data and then I go, didn't really perform over the last years, and the habit of people is changing a lot and hasn't been converting that well over the last years. So I really think that programmatic is the field that everyone has to look at. Ironically, it is on the first perspective less transparent than the platforms are. Like we cannot forget that Meta was pioneering political regulation on political advertising. Like Meta decided to verify accounts. They decided to implement a library. They decided to restrict the targeting options. That was nothing that they were legally required to do. That's something they did for the integrity work as a platform, right? And if you look at TTPA and the regulation, it seems like that the regulators were looking at what Facebook was doing in terms of regulation, and then trying to build a regulation around that. So that just as a side note. So programmatic, I think, will play a huge role. Digital out of home only works in cities and crowded areas. In Germany, we have a couple of state elections coming up. And when I'm talking to political parties that approach me, they say, I cannot put digital out of home in rural landscape areas. I cannot place there huge billboards because I don't have the budget. So how do I get still access to the people who are there? And I really think it comes down to programmatic and to find ways to more contextualized targeting. But at the same time, beside the placement of ads, there's another element, very shortly, is that it's coming down to the point that campaigners has to test content faster. And there are there's one word I hasn't mentioned yet, which is artificial intelligence, AI, and I'm happy to be the first one for the AI bingo. So that's definitely something that we are also looking at, right? In terms of how you test content, how you identify trends, how you push the organic reach, and how you can maybe then accelerate that through other advertising strategies and expand it into, for example, programmatic advertising, right? So it really also comes down on how you test your message, how you try to increase the organic reach with the limitations that the platforms gives you right now. We experiment with synthetic focus groups, for example, that we simulate focus groups and try to test the messages. So the innovation is on the way. The same thing that we see early prototypes, tools that have dashboards, for example, that generate the transparency notices and so on. In terms of the channel, it's programmatic. It's the biggest field because there's the biggest potential still to reach a mass of people. So that's why I think that the space that Maya is in and a couple of other players is very, very promising to be the first ones who are going to deliver TTPI compliant solutions.
Well, Jochen, you already dropped the AI word. So, of course, Maya, Battleground AI has AI already in its name. So, yeah, I mean, Jochen already opened the discussion. What role, from your perspective, will automation and AI play in replacing the reach that was previously bought via ads?
Yeah, I think it guess it's a good timing to have both of this happening because you can still, regain a strategic advantage by innovating with AI. And I think it comes down to kind of two main buckets, which we're kind of just talked about too. But I think one is the personalization, being able to still have that context, that personalization in the messaging, even if it's not inherently based on those data sets. Again, it's still possible to do that, especially with AI. Again, artificial focus groups, but also creating personas for people that you want to create content around. That's where we had really started, which is taking those personas and starting to build content that we think will more deeply resonate with those audiences. And that is not, you do not need to have any data to do that. And then again is frequency. Like I think you need to be in front of people all the time. You need to start earlier. You need to be seen. I think, anywhere between 10 and 20 times at least from folks. And now that might be harder. But with these new tools, you can scale that frequency, scale that personalization, and start to really do this in a much more efficient, effective way. And the greatest part is that it actually isn't that expensive. And I think because of this new tool, we're able to do that in a much more effective way. And even if the cost of the advertising is starting to go up and the placements are going to be more expensive, the development and the execution of it can start to be more efficient. And that frees us up because at the end of the day, the thing that's going to be most valuable here is like your human creativity. And so if we can start to really churn out ideas and frequency and personalization, that can really start to free us up to do this a lot better. So again, I think there's opportunity here. It's not all just like doom and gloom when it comes to regulations, but I know you're obviously in it much more day to day with many clients. But yeah, that's what I hope, and that's what I think we're starting to see here too.
Thank you. Now, before we come to the final part of the discussion, let's take a step back. I mean, some people, some observers said that there were unintended consequences of the regulation. Maya, you already mentioned that a bit earlier. Perhaps the commission really didn't foresee everything in terms of the consequences, and perhaps may have shot itself and also some others in the foot with the regulation. Now they're trying to, of course, clarify. But I mean, what's your overall broader take? Do you think, and Jochen, you also touched upon it in the beginning, do you think that this kind of banning political ads is ultimately a good thing? Or will it hurt, the small organizations, the smaller actors, the NGOs, to a much higher degree than intended? And will it actually do overall then more harm than good? Give me your broad brush.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we need regulations when it comes to new technology. We need seat belts on our new tools, but we need them to be effective, and we need them to address the actual underlying problem. I'm very supportive of regulation, but we see this problem here in the States, in California, where there's a lot of regulation, and that has pushed a lot of smaller, especially in political advertising, and that pushed a lot of smaller campaigns or candidates to not even try it. Because it becomes too burdensome. And I think at the end of the day, and this we kind of used to touch on this in the beginning, the real underlying problem isn't the advertising, right? It's the organic content. And now we're all going to be overly competing on the organic side. The platforms are still operating in Europe, it's just not from an ad perspective. So you're all going to be much more focused on organic content. And that is really where a lot of that misinformation and no disclaimers and no transparency is happening. That's where a lot of that those challenges arise is really in those ways to create virality through organic content, and often that is very clearly not being addressed in this situation. So I would say that this is probably, and I know I'm sitting in another country observing this, but I do think that is relatively misguided. I think there's some misguided legislation we are facing here as well. And so it's challenging, and we have to be on the forefront of trying to inform legislators. And it's hard to be in the reactive mode all the time.
Thanks for the take, Maya. So Maya thinks it's misguided by and large. And I asked for the broad brush. Jochen, what's your take?
We have to consider what are the origins of TTPA. The origins go back to 2018. They go back to Cambridge Analytica. They go back to the Brexit. They go back to the awareness that new platforms could have a massive potential impact on election interference, right? So it's not that TTPA was a surprise. I'm following the process for the last 4 years. I've been in touch with the regulators for the last 6-7 years to talk about the issue. And what we see with TTPA is that it is necessary, it is important, it has to be transparent. And the transparency level is so important in terms of that we need standards, right? As I mentioned before, Facebook Meta was pioneering it. TTPA kind of looked at it and said, we even increase it and make it more difficult and more complex. And this is where the problem comes in. But also we have to ask ourselves, do we want to live in a democratic society, in a democratic Western world, where visibility of political content relies on paid advertising? Because even before TTPA, the playing field was not equal, right? So someone who had more money was able to get more reach. So suddenly your visibility depends on the cash that you have on your bank account and how much are you able to spend. So it's not like that the advertising of political ads before that was a big democratic improvement. It was just a necessity because that's how platforms make their money. We run ads, as Mark Zuckerberg said, right? So at the end, if you want to be seen in an election campaign, or if you want to inform citizens or convince them, you had to pay on these platforms. Now with banning political ads, it definitely not strengthens democracy. It basically weakens it. And there are strategies that platforms could implement because they are not neutral, right? And this is the basic element that the European Commission took into place. By excluding political advertising, it's even more that we are more pushed, as Maya said, towards organic competition with entertainment and commercial content. And also what I would wish is that that regulators don't see political ads, for example, as something dangerous or per se, right? Or something that needs to be regulated. Like we as an agency now even have to make transparent the full amount of revenue that we generate with our clients, not only related to the ad, but in general. Like imagine something like this would happen in a commercial world. It's not about selling shoes when you run political ads, but at the same time, it's not something dirty. It's not something that needs to be restricted. It's actually the opposite. It is constitutional in a democratic society to be seen and to be aware, and not to stick in an age of the 1990s where you put flyers into every single household, right? So it's not strengthening. And I think that the regulation went beyond, and I think Brussels is still recalibrating and looking towards what to change. And I also think that members of parliament on the European level, state level, are just slowly starting to realize what TTPA means to them. So when I was in conversation with political parties on the European level, as well on the national level in Germany, I talked to them and said, look, this is going to be extremely difficult to implement. And there's a high risk that platforms completely opt out when it comes to political ads. And and now they're calling me back and telling me, we have a problem with the upcoming election, right? I don't think that there will be a huge rollback, but I definitely think that will be room to adaptation and a room to change. And it just slowly arrives in the headquarters what the consequences of TTPA are. But once again, how do we look towards the big tech platforms, the big platforms that are constituting the biggest arenas where we build our opinions, where citizens build their opinions? And now we have to compete with the latest TikTok trends, which is fine, but the algorithm is not favoring political ads, political content. It's actually downgrading it. And there's a room to improvement on a very easy strategies and options that platforms could implement. I just wrote a LinkedIn article about that, what platforms actually should do to strengthen democratic discourses rather than making it more weakened by now completely banning ads.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Jochen. Miriam has posted an inquiry for the swarm intelligence. Is anyone already working with a programmatic partner who is DSGVO, so the German data protection regulation, compliant even after October? For now, I haven't had any positive feedback from potential partners. So if you happen to work with somebody who qualifies as DSGVO compliant, let Miriam know. Maya, Jochen, would you be able to help Miriam in whatever way on this?
From my perspective, Miriam, just shoot me a message. Let's talk.
Great. Thanks, Jochen. Here's your clue, Miriam. So hopefully, and let us know how it goes. It's great that we are able to facilitate intros here. I'm very happy about that. That's what we are founded for. So before we come to the final round, let me just come back to the audience and ask you once again whether you have anything in terms of questions. Nick has contributed a thought that maybe also the cancelled presidential election in Romania, which of course was also about disinformation and the question of political ads and where they come from, might have also been a big motivator in bringing TTPA to this stage that we have now seen. Thanks for contributing that. Well, if there are no more questions, comments, or thoughts, I would like to ask the two of you, well, if you were campaigning, if you were advising a campaign manager today, what would be the 3 steps that you would recommend in terms of adaptation before 2026? Jochen, starting with you, what would be your recommendations?
Again, campaign manager. Okay, good. So I would suggest 3 concrete steps before 2026 that I would take. First, build compliance into your strategy right now. So even in the gray zone time, that definitely Q4 will be, start labeling contents transparently, keep records of the spending, the targeting, train your team in the TTPA requirements, implement all the legal processes that has to be needed. If you practice early, you won't scramble during the election year, for example, next year. So that's the first thing, right? So really don't try to avoid it, really build the compliance into your strategy now. Second, on a short term, I would also shift resources into organic visibility, invest in video first content, collaboration across accounts, mobilization networks, find ways to reach and amplify your message without paid ads. And at the same time, as we are talking right now, partner up with TTPA compliant solutions and be willing to invest in testing them. That's an important thing. I wouldn't be too scared about Q4 and Q1 next year by saying maybe not everything is perfect and we run into problems with the authorities. It is a process. And I think the earlier you adopt to it, the earlier you test messages, the earlier you test new advertising placements, and try once again, think about article number 8, what constitutes a political ad, and the better you are positioned ahead. And third, I would experiment with new tools, as Maya already mentioned, right? So if it's AI-driven content testing, if it's contextual targeting, and transparency dashboards that help you to accelerate your content, the campaigns that learn tools like this will be ahead from others that are coming up. So compliant readiness, organic reach, and innovation testing. These are the 3 things that I would do as a campaign manager.
Thanks for that. Maya, what would your 3 suggestions or recommendations be?
Yeah, those are awesome ones. Yeah, I would say first, and there's a bit of overlap, but I would say start to, of course, integrate the new protocols, but also figure out ways that you can start to free up some of your capacity whether that's with new tools. AI is bringing a lot of opportunity for you to free up a lot of tasks that are taking up a lot of time outside of this in your day-to-day. You're going to need more time. You're going to need a lot more time to figure this out and be creative and work with your team and work internally with stakeholders. So figure out ways to free up capacity. And then, yeah, innovate with new tools, which goes kind of hand in hand with that. And also push companies or platforms or agencies to be the ones to help you do that. If you're a practitioner and you need that compliance, you need a programmatic vendor that's compliant, push your vendors to do that and give them reasons and rationale to do it. Drive the innovation that's needed in your market, because no one else is going to do it. And then I know I've said it a few times, but like the personalization and the scalability that you can achieve is really unique now in new innovations and new tools and platforms. And so really try to think about how to create those messages. I know it's going to take more time at first, but try to think about ways that you can drive deeper personalizations, relationship building. Human and human connection and interaction is going to be most important always in these efforts. And how then can you take that personalization and really build it into your online strategy in new ways? So hopefully we can continue to see how that evolves now that we go into the fall and the next year's election season. But do it now. Yeah, do it now.
Super. And the last question fittingly comes from the audience. Paula asks, well, for now, of course, all of this TTPA impacts the EU. Do you see this expanding into other regions? Maya, do you see this potentially coming to the US anytime soon? Or would we expect this to show up in Asia or Africa or Australia? Or would we think that this will be basically specific to Europe for better or for worse?
Yeah, I think we are taking quite a reactive approach to any, like we're very behind on the forward-thinking policy discussion here, and obviously it's from a political advertising perspective a much larger place that these companies would hopefully likely not pull out of. But again, you don't know. I think right now in this political climate, we are charging ahead with a lack of legislation on a national perspective when it comes to AI or political campaigns. I think state legislation, we could potentially see that in a place like California or New York. Though there's possible here in Colorado has some of that as well. So maybe state-based in the US, which is a whole other complication. Potentially other countries, yeah, certainly. I mean, you could look at Canada with other regulations, Australia, potentially other countries as well who are thinking about these regulations. So I don't think it's going to be just EU specific, but I think it's a little bit of a testing ground to see how this goes. And so, folks will be watching and see if there is, as you pointed out, some changes in those regulations or just more clarity, so people can actually move forward. I think, having some nebulous policies can be especially challenging.
Jochen, I see you nodding, so I take it you agree, or do you have anything to add there?
I agree. Just want to add one element is that if political advertising and the revenue generated out of political advertising in the European Union would have a significant stake in the total revenue of these platforms, I assume the probability that they would have adapted to TTPA is quite high. So if you look at the size of the political advertising market in the US and compare it to Europe, it's more than 10x, way more than 10x, right? So I agree with Maya. I don't see anything coming in the US on a national level. Actually, we see more like a rollback in terms of that. If that in theory would come, I think the platforms would try to apply to it because it's just in terms of the revenue share stake that they have in this field, it's too high, and we in Europe are too small, and so it doesn't have that much of a financial implication to say we follow these rules and we invest more money, resources, and maybe more compliance risk into it.
Thank you, Jochen. Well, on this note, thanks a lot both for contributing your expertise. It's been great. From our side, as you have seen, Lucy already posted that next week there's the next webinar and it's going to be a digital product demo with PAL8, who are developing a great product to analyze the European Parliament discussions and policy making. And of course, there's the Political Tech Summit, which will happen for the second time from the 23rd to the 24th of January. There are still early bird tickets for a couple of weeks, and then it will switch to the regular price. So make sure you have your ticket. Very much looking forward to seeing you all there. It's going to be great. So once again, thanks Jochen, thanks Maya. It's been great. And everybody, have a great evening. See you next time. Good night.